There are names in Italy that have outlived empires. Names that sat at the head of banquet tables while popes were crowned, that signed treaties, that funded cathedrals, that were carved into marble long before anyone thought to ask what was actually written in the blood behind them. For centuries, the assumption was simple. A great Italian name meant a great Roman line, an unbroken descent from the patricians of the ancient world, passed down like an heirloom, generation after generation, family after family. Then geneticists opened the archive that no genealogist could forge. And the story stopped being simple. This is the story of what DNA revealed when researchers finally looked past the coats of arms and into the genome itself. Behind names like Colonna, Orsini, Caetani, Farnese, Medici, Visconti, Sforza, Borghese, Barberini, Ruffo, Caracciolo, Pignatelli, Del Balzo, and Aldobrandini, and found something older, stranger, and far more layered than a single dynasty descending cleanly from Rome. For generations, the accepted narrative was almost aristocratic in its neatness. Italy's great families, the story went, were living monuments to continuity. Rome had never really fallen, not in the blood. It had simply changed clothing, from senators to cardinals, from consuls to condottieri, from Roman gens to Renaissance casata. A name like Colonna, some genealogists insisted, stretched back to ancient Roman roots. Families built entire identities, chapels, and marriages around the idea that their bloodline was a straight line to antiquity, untouched by the centuries of invasion, migration, and upheaval that reshaped the rest of the peninsula around them. It was a comforting story. Prestige as biology, nobility as genetic destiny. And it made a certain kind of sense, at least on paper. Italy has one of the longest continuously documented aristocratic histories in Europe. Church records, land grants, and marriage contracts stretch back centuries in astonishing detail. Papal bulls named the Colonna and Orsini as rivals for control of Rome itself, their feuds so old and so bitter that by the time the Renaissance arrived, no one could quite remember a Rome without them. The Medici built a banking empire, then a duchy, then bloodlines that married into the royal houses of France. The Sforza seized Milan by force and then spent generations trying to make that seizure look like destiny. Each family had scribes. Each family had chapels built specifically to house the bones of ancestors, with the family name carved above the door as if the stone itself were a kind of proof. If any bloodlines in Europe were going to demonstrate an unbroken elite lineage stretching back toward antiquity, surely it would be here, in the one country that never stopped writing everything down. But historians noticed the first cracks long before DNA entered the room. Italy, unlike an isolated island or a remote mountain valley, was never sealed off from the rest of the Mediterranean world. It was the crossroads of it. Etruscans in the north center, Greek colonists across the south, Phoenician and Carthaginian traders along the coasts, Roman expansion pulling in soldiers, slaves, and settlers from every province of an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates. Then came the Ostrogoths, the Lombards, the Byzantines reclaiming the south, Arab rule across Sicily for over 2 centuries, Norman kings displacing Arab rule in turn, Angevin and Aragonese dynasties fighting over the crown of Naples. If Italy's elite bloodlines had truly remained untouched through all of that, they would be the genetic exception in a peninsula defined, more than almost anywhere else in Europe, by contact. There was a second, quieter anomaly too, one visible only to genealogists willing to look closely at their own paperwork. Many of the most prestigious Italian surnames were not, in fact, born with the families that now carried them. Titles and names were bought, granted, inherited through daughters who married into other houses, and sometimes simply adopted by families eager to attach themselves to older, more prestigious lines. A surname, in other words, could travel through history along a completely different path than the biology underneath it, carried forward not by an unbroken chain of fathers, but by law, by patronage, and occasionally by convenient reinvention. That contradiction is what genetics finally had the tools to test. Researchers turned to 3 separate archives written directly into the body. Y chromosome DNA, passed almost unbroken from father to son, allowed scientists to trace deep paternal lines, useful for testing whether a surname's father-to-son inheritance matched a single ancient point of origin. Mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, offered a second and often very different thread. And whole genome autosomal analysis, drawing on the full mixture of ancestry inherited from every branch of the family tree, gave researchers the closest thing available to a complete regional history written into a living population. None of these tools work like a simple ancestry percentage on a certificate. Each one is closer to a separate historical witness, offering a partial account that only makes sense once compared against the others. Why DNA might place a paternal line within a haplogroup common across the Eastern Mediterranean. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through mothers, might tell a completely different geographic story from the same family. And autosomal analysis, drawing on both parents and all 4 grandparents at once, often reveals the fullest and most complicated picture of all, because it does not forget the ancestors that surname records left out. What they found did not simply confirm the dynasty story. It complicated it. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. Studies of Italian population structure, including large-scale genomic surveys comparing northern, central, and southern Italian populations, revealed something the old aristocratic narrative had quietly ignored. Italy was never one genetic population wearing different regional clothing. It was, and remains, one of the most genetically stratified populations in Western Europe. Northern Italian ancestry carries a stronger signature of ancient populations tied to the Alps and continental Europe. Central Italy shows a complex blend connected to both Etruscan-era populations and the expansion of Rome itself. Southern Italy and Sicily carry unmistakable genetic contributions from Greek colonization, North African and Near Eastern contact during centuries of Byzantine and Arab rule, and further mixing during the Norman period. The story did not collapse. It widened. What looked like a simple origin, one great Roman line, radiating outward through history, was beginning to look like a layered history instead, built from wave after wave of contact that never fully erased what came before it. If this kind of hidden layering fascinates you as much as it fascinates historians, consider subscribing, because almost no European bloodline turns out to be as simple as the family crest suggests. To make sense of what the genome was showing, researchers began weighing several possible frameworks, none of them mutually exclusive. The first is straightforward admixture, centuries of intermarriage between elite families and the regional populations around them, meaning that even a family with a documented medieval pedigree was still, biologically, absorbing new ancestry with almost every generation. The second is founder effect within a smaller elite population, the idea that Italy's noble families, marrying largely within a restricted circle of other noble houses for centuries, may show a genetic signature distinct from the general population not because they preserved ancient Roman blood specifically, but because repeated intermarriage within a small elite class left its own detectable fingerprint, regardless of how far back that elite class actually began. The third is regional continuity without dynastic continuity, meaning the deep ancestral layers researchers detect in a place like Lazio or Campania may genuinely stretch back toward Roman era and pre-Roman populations, but that continuity belongs to the region and its broader population, not exclusively to any single aristocratic surname claiming descent from it. A fourth possibility, harder to prove but impossible to dismiss, is what researchers sometimes call a ghost signal, an ancestral contribution detectable in the genome but not clearly traceable to any single well-documented historical population. In southern Italy especially, some analyses have picked up ancestry components that do not map neatly onto Greek colonization, Roman expansion, or Arab-Norman contact alone, hinting at older or less recorded movements of people across the central Mediterranean that written history simply never captured. Untangling these possibilities required something more powerful than family trees. Required ancient DNA. The landmark evidence came from a series of ancient genome studies examining skeletal remains from pre-Roman and Roman-era Italy, including analyses of Etruscan burial sites in central Italy and imperial-era Roman cemeteries. These studies did something no aristocratic archive ever could. They compared DNA extracted directly from people who lived in antiquity to the DNA of Italians living today. the Etruscan findings alone unsettled a long-standing debate. For centuries, some scholars had argued, based on ancient writers like Herodotus, that the Etruscans originated in Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. Ancient DNA complicated that picture. It suggested Etruscan populations were genetically similar to their Latin-speaking neighbors, more locally rooted in Italy than a foreign origin theory required, even as their language and culture remained strikingly distinct from everyone around them. Language, once again, was not walking in step with biology. A separate line of research, examining imperial-era burials from the city of Rome itself, found something almost the opposite of the Etruscan case. Where Etruscan genomes looked largely local, the population of Rome at the height of the empire looked remarkably cosmopolitan, carrying ancestry linked to the Eastern Mediterranean, the Near East, and North Africa, consistent with a capital city that drew people from every province it governed. By late antiquity, that same population had begun shifting again, this time showing greater affinity with populations from Central and Northern Europe, tracking the political upheavals that reshaped the peninsula after the empire's collapse. Rome, in other words, was never one population wearing a toga. It was several populations, arriving in waves, each one leaving its own layer before the next one settled on top of it. And that is where the deepest twist of the story emerges. Not a single Roman dynasty, preserved intact behind marble and marriage contracts. Not even a single ancient population at all. What the evidence increasingly points to is something closer to imperial Rome itself in miniature. A cosmopolitan mixture, built from the movement of soldiers, merchants, slaves, and settlers across the entire Mediterranean world, later inherited, unevenly, by the families who rose to prominence on top of it. The genome was not erasing the story of noble Roman descent. It was revealing an older, far more cosmopolitan population beneath it, one where Roman itself was never a single bloodline to begin with, but an empire's worth of ancestry, folded into one identity, and later claimed by dynasties who mistook consolidation for purity. The surprise was not that Italy's great families carried deep, ancient roots. The surprise was how much of that root system reached outward, toward Greece, toward North Africa, toward Anatolia, toward the Alps, long before any single family name existed to claim it. This matters for more than 14 surnames on a coat of arms. It is a reminder that dynasties are, in the end, a cultural and legal fiction laid over a biological reality that never respected the boundaries drawn around it. Population history rarely moves like a family tree, with clean branches splitting outward from a single trunk. It moves more like a river system, merging and splitting and merging again, carrying sediment from 1,000 tributaries into every place it eventually settles. Old maps of noble descent were built from documents, and documents can only record marriage. Never migration, never conquest, never the quieter movement of ordinary people whose names never made it onto a crest at all. There is something almost democratic about what the genome reveals, even when it is describing the ancestry of history's most exclusive families. A duke and a farmer working the same stretch of Lazio soil for 1,000 years may carry more genetic history in common with each other than either of them carries with a supposed ancestor from 2,000 years earlier. Prestige, it turns out, was never a biological category. It was a legal one, a social one, occasionally a military one, layered on top of a population that had already been mixing for millennia before anyone thought to draw a coat of arms around a portion of it. Picture the landscape underneath all of this. The Roman Campagna at dusk, its umbrella pines dark against a sky the color of rust, aqueduct arches standing broken and enormous across fields that have been farmed since before Rome had walls. Walk north into Tuscany, into the soft, folded hills where Etruscan tombs still sit half-swallowed by cypress trees, their painted interiors showing banquets held by people whose language we can barely read today. Walk south into Sicily, where Greek temples stand a few kilometers from Norman cathedrals built on the foundations of mosques, themselves built on the foundations of Byzantine churches, a single hillside carrying 4 civilizations without ever fully erasing the one before it. Stand in the cloister at Monreale, where Arab horseshoe arches, Byzantine gold mosaics, and Norman stone carving occupy the same building without contradiction, as though 3 different empires had quietly agreed to share the same roof. That layering is not metaphorical. It is written, quite literally, into the DNA of the people who still live there. In the shape of a nose, the color of an eye, a resistance to a disease that arrived with one invader and never entirely left with the next. Even the light changes the story. Along the Adriatic coast, mornings carry a haze that once watched Byzantine ships arrive from Constantinople. Inland, in the hill towns of Umbria and the Marche, the fog that settles into the valleys each autumn has settled there since before Rome existed at all, indifferent to which empire happened to be governing the ridge above it that particular century. So when a family today traces its name back through centuries of marriage contracts, expecting to find one clean Roman line waiting at the end of the search, what the evidence increasingly suggests is something both smaller and far larger at once. Smaller, because no single family preserved antiquity in isolation. Larger, because the ancestry they carry does not belong only to their name, it belongs to an entire Mediterranean world that moved through Italy for thousands of years and left something of itself in almost everyone who remained. The dynasty was never the story. The dynasty was only the label placed, centuries later, on something that had already been mixing, merging, and migrating long before anyone thought to write a name down and call it noble. Perhaps that is the more honest inheritance. Not a single unbroken line running back to a senator in a toga, but a confluence: Etruscan farmers, Greek settlers, Roman soldiers, North African traders, Lombard warriors, Norman kings, all of them quietly present in the same body, none of them canceling out the others. The name on the crest was never wrong, exactly. It simply told a much smaller story than the one written underneath it, in a script far older than Latin, waiting patiently for someone to finally learn how to read it. If a hidden history like this speaks to you, let me know in the comments which family, or which forgotten population, deserves this kind of investigation next. Because in Italy, as it turns out, almost no bloodline runs in a straight line, and the ones that claim to are usually hiding the most interesting layers underneath.